Hello, my friends. I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it where you are? I always find it fascinating to imagine all of us scattered across the world, sharing the same quiet moment while drifting through the same ancient dream. Tonight, we'll wander far away, to a city that once hummed with the noise of ships and seagulls, markets and laughter, prayers and whispers. We're going to Ostia, the busy harbor of Rome, and into the home of one ordinary man whose name the history books have long forgotten. Though his days once flowed like hours, hour after hour, thought after thought, the same sun rising, the same moon fading. His name was Lucius Aelius Varro, a merchant, not rich, not poor, just somewhere in between, standing firmly within that wide, invisible space the Romans called the Ordo Medius, the Middle Order. His home stood near the Via della Fosse, where you could still smell the salt wind from the sea and hear the muffled echo of oars dipping into the Tiber's dark water. When the first light touched the tiled roofs, it painted everything in pale gold. The courtyards, the clay jars, the mosaics on the floor, each detail holding centuries of habit and repetition. Lucius woke early as Romans did. The air was cool, touched by the faint scent of smoke from the bakers' ovens nearby. You could hear footsteps in the narrow alley outside, the rustle of a broom against stone, the muted voice of a woman calling her children. Inside the domus, the household began to stir. The slave girl Tilla lighting the oil lamps, the boy Publius, sleepy and sullen, rubbing his eyes, the youngest, Flavia, giggling softly under her blanket while pretending to still be asleep. His wife, Claudia, was already awake, her hair pinned hastily, her movements quiet and efficient. She checked the amphory of oil, the basket of bread, the pitcher of watered wine, the same ritual every morning. The walls around them were painted with fading colors, fragments of flowers, birds, mythic scenes that once glowed bright red and blue, now softened by years of breath and smoke. Lucius stretched, adjusting the linen tunic over his shoulder, listening to the house breathe. There was something reassuring about those familiar sounds. The squeak of the wooden door, the gentle drip from the courtyard fountain, the flutter of pigeons nesting under the roof. He knew exactly how this day would unfold, and yet there was comfort in that sameness. He stepped into the atrium, where the household shrine, the lararium, stood in its corner. Two tiny bronze figures watched silently as he placed a pinch of incense into the dish, murmuring a few words to the household spirits. Not out of devotion, perhaps, but out of habit, the kind that wraps itself around your life until you no longer question it. Smoke rose and curled upward, slow and graceful, disappearing through the open skylight into the growing blue above. Outside, the street was already alive. The city of Ostia never really slept. It only dozed. Somewhere, a mule brayed, and the wooden wheels of a cart scraped against the cobblestones. A fishmonger was shouting about fresh catch from the coast. Murena, sardina, mullet. The scent of brine mingled with the sweetness of baked bread. The distant hum of voices felt like the sea itself, rolling in waves. Lucius looked up toward the direction of the harbor, thinking of the ships, those fragile, creaking vessels that carried his livelihood. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a vessel bearing Spanish oil was due to arrive, delayed perhaps by wind or rumor. He thought briefly of the captain, a man he'd met only once, and of the uncertainty of every trade deal that relied on weather, luck, and trust. Then he smiled faintly. There was no use worrying before breakfast. Inside, Claudia was arranging the iantaculum, the morning meal. Simple things. Flatbread, a bit of cheese, some olives, maybe honey if the jar hadn't run empty. The children sat at the low table, squabbling softly over a crust. It was such a small thing, this meal, but it carried with it the rhythm of centuries. the daily act that tethered each Roman family to the same invisible pulse. Lucius sat down and broke a piece of bread, dipping it into olive oil. The flavor was bitter, strong, earthy. Claudia spoke about the price of grain, how the neighbor's son had joined a scribe's apprenticeship, how a friend had seen strange omens in the sky, a comet or something that might have been one. Lucius nodded, half listening, his mind already drifting toward the day's work. But before he rose from the table, he paused for a moment, watching his family in the dim light. The quiet warmth of home, the laughter, the simple routine. It all seemed fragile, like pottery that could crack with one careless movement. He wondered briefly whether people in the future, people like you listening now, would ever imagine how ordinary a Roman morning truly was. No emperors, no battles, no marble splendor. Just bread, olive oil, and the hum of a city waking to life. And as the first real sunbeam touched the wall, lighting the small bronze figures of the household gods, Lucius stood, adjusted his belt, and prepared to step out into the day, unaware that his ordinary footsteps were becoming, slowly and quietly, part of the endless story of humanity. The house was fully alive now, breathing like a quiet organism stitched together from routine and memory. The courtyard echoed with the faint splash of water as Tilla, the young slave girl, carried a small amphora from the fountain, her bare feet leaving tiny wet prints on the mosaic floor. The morning had settled into that tender, golden rhythm. Neither rush nor rest, the fragile balance between what has just begun and what will soon fade into noon. Lucius stood by the doorway for a moment, feeling the air change as sunlight filtered in through the open roof. Dust floated in the beam like drifting ash, each speck glowing before dissolving into shadow. In that calm shimmer, one could almost believe that time itself had slowed down, that the city outside waited politely for him to start his day before resuming its noise. He heard Claudia's voice from the inner room, soft but steady, instructing one of the servants to bring out the laundry baskets. Today was washing day. A row of tunics and sheets would soon hang across the small terrace above the kitchen, fluttering like pale banners of domestic victory. Claudia's efficiency was quiet but absolute. She managed the household like a commander of peace. Her battles were against disorder, her triumphs measured in clean linen and well-fed children. The eldest son, Marcus, was already dressed for his morning lessons. His wax tablet and stylus lay on the table beside a crumbling piece of bread. He was 12, that delicate age when boys stood halfway between obedience and pride. Lucius watched him for a moment, remembering his own schooling decades ago, the smell of the classroom, the stern voice of the Ludi Magister reciting verses from Virgil, the slap of a reed on the table whenever someone drifted into daydreams. The memory felt warm now, though it hadn't been back then. Flavia, the youngest, was chasing the household cat around a column, her laughter spilling into the air like water over stone. Claudia called her name in a tone that mixed affection and authority, the Roman mother's voice that carried generations of discipline behind it. Flavia slowed down, caught between guilt and giggles, and settled on the floor beside her small wooden doll. Outside, the neighbors were waking too. From the street came the sound of a door creaking open, a woman shouting something about spilled grain, the rhythmic clatter of a cobbler's hammer. Somewhere, a flute player practiced a melody, thin and uneven, as if the notes themselves were still stretching after sleep. Lucius stepped into the courtyard to look at the household gods again, the Laras and Penates. Their bronze faces gleamed faintly, and for a moment he wondered if they ever tired of watching. They had stood there through storms, quarrels, laughter, childbirth, sickness, and 100 small mornings like this one. He whispered another quiet prayer, not asking for fortune, but for calm, a steady heart, safe trade winds, healthy children, the same wishes every father had whispered since time began. He crossed back into the Kulina, the small, smoky kitchen where the slave cook, a man named Gaius, was stirring a pot of barley porridge for later. Gaius was old, his back slightly bent, but his hands still moved with the confidence of long habit. Steam curled up from the pot, filling the room with the scent of grain and ash. On the wall, soot formed black patterns that looked almost intentional, as though time itself had painted them. "You'll be off soon?" Gaius asked without turning his head. Lucius nodded. "To the market, to see if the oil shipment has arrived." Gaius grunted, neither hope nor doubt in his voice. "The gods favor those who rise early," he muttered, though they both knew fortune had its own ideas about fairness. Back in the main room, Claudia was helping Marcus tie his belt properly. The boy squirmed, complaining about the stiffness of the new tunic. She smiled faintly, tightening the knot anyway. "Discipline first," she said. "Comfort later." It was a lesson that Roman mothers believed as deeply as religion. Lucius lingered by the door, watching them. This was his world. Not the marble forums or the grand villas of senators, but this, the ordinary beauty of responsibility. He thought about how each morning looked the same, and yet each was slightly different, shaped by tiny choices, small gestures that went unnoticed but defined everything. When he finally stepped outside, the sunlight was stronger, glinting off the rooftops and jars stacked along the walls. The smell of fish and oil mingled with the faint sweetness of figs. He heard a donkey bray somewhere down the street, followed by laughter, two children running after it with sticks. The city was stirring, stretching its limbs, preparing for the long Roman day ahead. Behind him, the house continued its rhythm. Claudia scolded the cat for knocking over a cup. Tilla swept the floor again, collecting dust that would return by afternoon. Flavia sang softly to her doll, a tune she'd learned from the nursemaid. Marcus, now ready, stood in the doorway, waiting for his father to walk him part of the way to his teacher's house. Lucius placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and for a brief moment, he thought of how fragile all this was. The laughter, the warmth, the familiarity. Empires could rise and fall, but this quiet morning, this ordinary love, was what truly held the world together. As they stepped into the street, the city embraced them. The uneven rhythm of footsteps, the hum of conversation, the glint of sunlight on the marble fountain at the corner. Somewhere in the distance, the sea glimmered like a sheet of metal, whispering the eternal promise of trade, of change, of endless return. The day had begun, and the house behind them faded into the gentle chorus of life. One of thousands, each carrying its own story, each awakening to the same light. The streets of Ostia carried a peculiar melody in the early morning, a rhythm made of rolling carts, distant calls of fishmongers, the scrape of sandals over cobblestones, and the occasional bray of a mule. Lucius and Marcus moved carefully through this chorus, their steps measured, aware that each footfall was part of a quiet ritual that had repeated for generations, yet never exactly the same. The sunlight now warmed their faces, spilling golden stripes over the uneven stones, revealing the dust that settled after the night and the faint glimmer of dew clinging to the roof tiles. They returned home with a slow, purposeful pace, the market momentarily forgotten as Lucius's thoughts wandered to the breakfast that awaited them, the simple, steady meal that would tether the morning to the household. Inside, the Kulina was already infused with the sense of bread baking, honey thick and golden in its jar, and the faint, nutty aroma of oil poured over cheese. Even the walls seemed to hold the warmth of cooking, absorbing and reflecting it like a quiet, patient companion. Claudia had arranged the table with care. Small clay plates for each child, a slightly larger one for Lucius, and a shallow bowl of porridge for Gaius, the cook. A loaf of coarse bread, still slightly warm, lay on the edge, alongside a plate of olives and a little honey. Nothing grand, nothing extravagant, but each item carried meaning, nourishment, stability, ritual, and the gentle cadence of family life. Lucius sat down with Marcus on one side and Flavia on the other. He watched the children as they reached for bread, their small hands fumbling and knocking lightly against the plates. Flavia's fingers were sticky with honey before she realized it, and she licked them with a quiet delight, smiling at no one in particular. Marcus, more careful, cut his portion slowly, his eyes darting toward his father for approval. Lucius nodded once, approvingly, as though that small gesture could convey the endless reassurance a father carries for his children. Claudia poured a little watered wine into a cup, the deep red of the diluted liquid catching the light. She placed it in front of Lucius, a gesture that was both simple and profound, a symbol of the household's shared rhythm, of the life they maintained together in the midst of the bustling city. There was a quiet power in such small acts, a subtle reminder that the weight of the world was sometimes best measured in the breaking of bread and the pouring of wine. The conversation was gentle, drifting between observations of the day ahead and small details, seemingly unimportant, yet weaving the fabric of their lives. Claudia spoke of the neighbor's laundry, the fresh fish that had arrived at the market, and a rumor of a ship from Carthage delayed in the harbor. Lucius listened with half an ear, tasting the bread and cheese, feeling the texture and weight of the food on his tongue, noting the warmth of the room and the soft light playing across the walls. Outside, the city continued its quiet symphony. A baker called the arrival of fresh loaves, and the scent of warm dough mingled with the salty tang of the harbor. Children from nearby homes ran along the streets, their voices rising and falling like small waves, chasing a stray dog or a rolling hoop. The sound of leather straps against the cobbles, the creak of wooden carts, and the faint murmur of sailors inspecting their ships created a backdrop to the intimate scene inside Lucius's home, a reminder of how the private and public lives of Ostia were intertwined, seamless, and unceasing. Lucius thought briefly about the bread, about how it had been kneaded, shaped, and baked. How many hands had touched it before it reached this table? Bakers, servants, perhaps even the children who had helped, under Claudia's supervision, in small ways that went unnoticed. He considered the slow journey of honey from hive to jar, the careful selection of olives, the pressing of oil into golden perfection. Everything carried time, effort, and a quiet order. The children began to finish, their plates cleared in small, imperfect movements. Flavia, now sticky with traces of honey, leaned back slightly, brushing crumbs from her tunic. Marcus licked his fingers clean, eyes still attentive to the smallest flicker of expression on his father's face. Lucius set down his cup, savored the faint sweetness on his tongue, and allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. It was in these ordinary acts that the rhythm of the household was most apparent, the continuous, unremarkable cycle that defined their days and yet carried the subtle beauty of permanence. Claudia collected the empty plates, stacking them neatly as she murmured to herself about the tasks that remained. Sweeping, laundry, tending the small herb garden in the corner of the courtyard. Each motion was deliberate, graceful in its own way, as if the house itself were alive and responding to her care. Lucius rose, feeling the weight of the day settling into him, knowing that soon he would step beyond the walls into the streets and the market, into the uncertain rhythm of trade, negotiation, and rumor. Yet, for now, there was this: the warmth of bread in hand, the scent of olive oil, the low murmur of family conversation, and the soft glow of morning light. A fragile, fleeting perfection that, once noticed, lingered in memory longer than the passing hours, carrying with it the quiet, enduring pulse of ordinary Roman life. By mid-morning, the sun had risen higher, spilling light across the courtyard and touching the mosaic floor in flickering patterns that shifted with the swaying of the oil lamp's shadows still lingering faintly on the walls. Lucius watched his children as they moved about the house, the quiet order of the morning beginning to stretch into the structured rhythm of the day. Marcus, now fully dressed in his tunic, sat at a small wooden desk near the atrium, his wax tablet and stylus in hand. The faint smell of beeswax and ink mixed with the lingering aroma of breakfast, creating a delicate and familiar atmosphere, one that had marked the mornings of countless Roman boys before him. Claudia adjusted Marcus's tunic one last time, smoothing the folds over his shoulders and tightening the belt, her fingers precise in their motions. She spoke softly, reminding him to pay attention, to respect his teacher, to remember the lessons of obedience and diligence that were considered as essential as reading or writing. Marcus nodded earnestly, his brown eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and anxiety. The weight of expectation rested lightly yet firmly upon him, a quiet gravity inherited from generations of careful parents and stern teachers. The teacher, a man named Tiberius, arrived shortly afterward, stepping into the atrium with the gentle but deliberate air of someone who carried both authority and routine. His robe brushed the floor softly, and in his hand he held a bundle of scrolls and a few sharpened styluses. Tiberius was neither young nor old, but he had the presence of someone who had seen countless students before Marcus, guiding them through the same letters, the same numbers, the same subtle moral lessons hidden in the folds of grammar and poetry. "Salve Marcus," Tiberius said, his voice steady and calm. "Let us begin." Marcus straightened immediately, as if the words themselves had carried invisible weight. The stylus tapped gently on the wax tablet, leaving thin, precise lines in the soft surface, forming the letters he had memorized from years of repetition. Lucius lingered nearby, observing the boy's hands, the tilt of his head, the slight furrow of concentration on his brow. There was something hypnotic in the act of learning, the silent dialogue between student and teacher, the small victories of a letter formed correctly, a word spelled without hesitation. Claudia watched from a distance, her expression softening as she noticed the subtle pride that warmed her heart. Education, she understood, was as much about discipline as it was about knowledge. Marcus would not only learn to read and write, he would learn to carry himself with patience, to respect authority, and to navigate the invisible currents of social expectation that defined the Roman household. These lessons, though quiet and often unnoticed, were the scaffolding upon which a boy would build his future. Meanwhile, Flavia, too young for formal schooling, played quietly nearby. She arranged small stones and pieces of pottery into patterns on the floor, her fingers careful, her brow furrowed with concentration. Even in play, there was instruction, the shaping of dexterity, observation, and the beginnings of imagination. Claudia occasionally called her name, guiding her gently, encouraging patience, attention, and the subtleties of social grace. Lucius stepped outside briefly to look at the courtyard, where the morning light danced across the fountain and the herbs Claudia tended. The city beyond was awake, the hum of merchants, sailors, and citizens blending into a steady, low background rhythm. He imagined the children one day moving through these streets on their own, carrying with them the lessons of home, the discipline, the curiosity, and the small rituals that structured their lives. Inside, the teacher continued, reciting lines from poetry, guiding Marcus's hand as he repeated letters and words aloud. There was no hurry, no alarm, only the slow, steady cadence of learning, punctuated by the occasional murmur of correction or encouragement. Each word was a thread, weaving Marcus into the larger fabric of Roman society, connecting him to ancestors and future generations alike. The household itself adapted to this quiet rhythm. Tilla swept the floors more lightly than before, mindful not to disturb the delicate concentration in the atrium. Gaius tended to a pot of water, preparing a small snack for later, moving in deliberate, measured motions. Claudia occasionally glanced at Flavia, offering small guidance without interrupting her play, maintaining the balance of attention and freedom that defined a well-run Roman home. Time passed, though it was marked not by clocks but by light and shadow. The letters on Marcus's tablet grew more confident, his hands steadier, his recitations more assured. Lucius felt a quiet satisfaction in this ordinary progression, understanding that these small, daily victories were the true substance of a life, the subtle triumphs unseen by the larger world, yet vital to its continued order. The morning continued in this gentle rhythm, a seamless blend of study, play, and quiet observation. Marcus absorbed the lessons, Flavia shaped her world in miniature, Claudia tended to the household, and Lucius moved quietly among them, the subtle pulse of his presence reinforcing the sense of security and continuity. Outside, Ostia carried on in its bustling harmony, the distant calls of merchants and the soft clatter of carts providing a muted counterpoint to the calm within the walls. By the time the first signs of midday approached, the household had settled into a comfortable cadence. Marcus laid down his stylus, satisfied with the progress of the morning. Flavia's small hands were stained with dust and play, and Claudia began to move toward preparations for the midday meal. Lucius lingered for a moment, taking in the scene, appreciating the quiet diligence, the gentle order, and the fleeting beauty of a day unfolding with quiet grace. By the time the sun had climbed higher, casting sharper lines across the rooftops and illuminating the terracotta tiles of Ostia, Lucius Aelius Vero stepped outside his house, adjusting his tunic and feeling the faint warmth of the day settling onto his shoulders. The city stretched before him, familiar and strange at once, a living mosaic of stone, wood, and the restless tide of human activity. Each street seemed to carry its own rhythm. The clip-clop of sandals on cobblestones, the muted squeak of cart wheels, the distant calls of sailors checking lines on their ships, and the faint laughter of children darting between market stalls. Lucius walked deliberately, allowing his eyes to absorb the details of the waking city. Merchants were already preparing their stalls, arranging amphorae, sacks of grain, and bundles of fresh fish. The scent of salt, oil, and brine mingled in the morning air, forming a complex perfume that was uniquely Ostia. From time to time, a baker would shout about fresh loaves, their aroma curling around the edges of narrow streets, inviting both hunger and memory to awaken. As he passed the neighboring homes, he caught glimpses of other families emerging from their doors. Mothers arranging breakfast, fathers adjusting belts and sandals, children squabbling softly as they prepared for lessons or play. Each household was a small world, humming quietly with its own rhythm. Yet all were connected by the common pulse of city life, the ebb and flow of trade, gossip, and daily necessity. Lucius paused briefly at the corner, near a fountain that gurgled steadily, its water sparkling in the morning sun. A group of boys played near its edge, tossing pebbles into the shallow basin and laughing at the splashes. He watched them for a moment, remembering Marcus and Flavia at that age, their small hands fumbling with toys and games, their curiosity uncontained, their imaginations vast. There was a certain poetry in these scenes, small, fleeting, and entirely human. Continuing down the street, he passed a stall where a fishmonger arranged fresh mullet and sardines on crushed ice. The man's voice rose in a rhythmic chant, advertising his catch in a way that seemed rehearsed, almost ritualistic. Nearby, a woman sold olives and figs, her hands deftly wrapping small bundles for customers while exchanging quiet gossip about which ship had arrived late or which neighbor's child had fallen ill. Every interaction, no matter how minor, carried layers of information, subtle social negotiation, and a shared understanding of the city's pulse. Lucius reached the market square, a wide open space filled with motion, sound, and the faint scent of the sea that always lingered in Ostia. Merchants shouted prices, sailors argued about cargo, and the occasional donkey brayed as it jostled against a cart. There was an intricate dance to it all, a choreography invisible to outsiders but entirely natural to those who had lived here long enough. Lucius navigated it effortlessly, nodding to familiar faces, exchanging brief words about shipments and trade, the sea, or the weather. He approached the stall of a Spanish oil trader, checking if the amphory had arrived. A few men lifted jars carefully from the back of a small vessel moored along the quay, balancing them with a practiced precision that suggested both experience and caution. Lucius examined the markings on the amphory, confirming the source and quality, noting slight imperfections or irregularities that could affect the price. Trade in Ostia was never just about goods. It was about observation, judgment, and the quiet negotiation of trust. Nearby, other merchants haggled over grain, wine, and cloth. A scribe sat on a low bench, recording transactions in a scroll with careful strokes of ink, while a group of children ran errands between stalls, balancing small baskets and learning, in small, unspoken ways, the structure and order of commerce. Lucius watched them for a moment, remembering Marcus and the lessons he would soon take in literacy and numeracy, understanding how deeply these mundane activities shaped the future. The market was alive with subtle stories. A sailor complained quietly about a delayed ship, sharing rumors of storms or pirates. A baker discussed new recipes with a neighbor. A woman whispered about the behavior of a senator's son visiting Ostia, and a small dog ran between baskets, sniffing at every corner, its movements weaving unnoticed patterns through the crowd. Lucius absorbed it all, feeling the city's life thread through him, connecting him to the larger currents of Roman existence. After confirming the arrival of the oil shipment, Lucius moved slowly through the square, observing the rhythm of commerce and community. There was a faint satisfaction in this motion, a recognition that the world had its own tempo, and that by participating with care and attention, one could find both sustenance and a sense of place. He thought about the work that awaited him back home, accounting, planning, and the quiet reflection on trade that occupied much of a merchant's life. Yet there was also this moment, this gentle immersion in the living pulse of Ostia, which reminded him of why he continued day after day. The sun climbed higher still, and Lucius turned toward the narrow street that led back to his home, the scent of fish lingering faintly on the air, mingling with the warmth of baked bread and olive oil from the morning meal. He carried with him not only the promise of trade and profit, but also the quiet affirmation of belonging, of participation in the enduring life of a city whose streets had known his ancestors and would, in some small measure, carry his own footsteps into memory. Lucius lingered among the crowded stalls, letting his gaze roam slowly over the tightly packed tables of merchants, their goods displayed with careful attention. Each amphora, basket, and bundle carried not just material value, but the subtle story of where it had come from: olives pressed on distant hillsides, figs dried under the southern sun, salted fish caught that very morning in the brine of the sea. The market was a tapestry of movement and negotiation, every gesture deliberate, every glance meaningful, though often invisible to anyone not attuned to the rhythms of Ostia. The trader from Hispania approached him first, a man with sun-leathered skin and fingers hardened from lifting amphory, his voice low and measured. "Lucius, the shipment is as expected. Quality is good, the amphory intact." The man's eyes flicked subtly toward the nearby crowd, aware of potential eavesdroppers, though Lucius noticed it with only a quiet, practiced understanding. Trust was measured in gestures as much as in words, in pauses and subtle nods, in the way hands rested on the clay jars. Lucius lifted a lid from one amphora, inhaling the sharp, earthy scent of oil. He ran a finger along the surface, noting the consistency and the clarity of the liquid, the faint trace of sediment. "It is as promised," he murmured, "but we must speak of price." His tone was neither harsh nor eager, but deliberate, a reflection of his role not only as buyer but as observer, as man engaged in the subtle game of commerce that depended as much on patience and perception as on money. Nearby, a group of women haggled over olives, their voices rising and falling in careful cadences, negotiating quantity and quality, each offering and counteroffer shaped by familiarity and shared understanding. A young boy ran between stalls, delivering messages, observing faces, and learning, perhaps unconsciously, the rhythm of social negotiation. The same rhythm Marcus would one day practice in letters, numbers, and observation at home. Lucius walked slowly along the row of stalls, greeting other merchants with nods, short words, and sometimes a faint smile. Rumors drifted past him like the gentle breeze. A ship delayed by a storm in the Tyrrhenian, a wealthy patrician's daughter betrothed to a senator's son, a minor theft at the docks. These small stories, the whispers and rumors, carried meaning. They were the threads that bound the community together, revealing allegiances, cautionary tales, and opportunities alike. He paused to inspect a crate of dried figs, their skins wrinkled and fragrant. The vendor, a woman from the countryside, explained how they had been harvested, sun-dried, and packed carefully to avoid spoilage. Lucius listened, not out of impatience, but as a careful student of life, for trade was never merely about goods, but about understanding people, places, and the movement of fortune. The murmur of coins echoed faintly as trades were made around him. A sailor exchanged a bag of small silver denarii for wine. A baker counted coins carefully, weighing them against the value of a sack of flour. Lucius noted each transaction with subtle attention, considering the implications for his own dealings, for the ebb and flow of supply and demand. Even the smallest purchase rippled through the city's economy, though few would pause to see the intricate patterns unfolding in the open square. As he spoke with the oil trader, other merchants edged closer, offering opinions, commenting softly on prices, the quality of goods, or the timing of the shipment. Lucius smiled faintly to himself, aware of the invisible currents in which he was moving. The dance of commerce, the subtle push and pull of ambition, trust and caution. Here, among the baskets and amphorae, Ostia revealed itself not as a collection of stones and streets, but as a living organism, breathing through negotiation, observation, and the quiet exchange of information. A small dog darted between stalls, sniffing for scraps, momentarily disrupting the careful arrangement of a basket of olives. A woman scolded it softly, though her words were gentle, as if the disturbance were merely another note in the symphony of the morning. Lucius watched the interplay, noting how every participant adjusted, adapted, and continued. A subtle lesson in patience, observation, and the interconnectedness of daily life. Having confirmed quantities and prices, Lucius began to calculate the logistics for transporting the amphorae back to his home. He considered which servants would carry the jars, the path through the alleys to avoid congestion, and the potential hazards along the quay where carts and animals jostled for space. Trade was never just about goods. It was about foresight, timing, and careful attention to the smallest details that could ripple outward into success or loss. With the morning's transactions completed, Lucius took a final slow walk through the market, absorbing the sights, sounds, and smells, the mingling of oil, sea, bread, and smoke. He noted the movement of the crowd, the subtle glances exchanged, the gestures that communicated more than words. Each detail was a small, necessary part of the day, of life in Ostia, of the continuity that stretched from generation to generation, as certain and as fragile as the rising sun. Turning back toward the narrow street leading home, Lucius carried with him not only the fruits of trade but the quiet satisfaction of participation, the steady pulse of belonging, and the faint but enduring hum of the city, alive, intricate, and endlessly patient in its ordinary splendor. By mid-afternoon, the heat of the Roman sun had settled over Ostia like a slow, golden blanket, pressing gently on the rooftops and tilting across the streets in elongated patterns. Lucius returned home, carrying not only amphorae and sacks of goods but also the subtle impressions of the morning. The measured hum of the market, the scent of oil and figs, the quiet negotiations that had unfolded with almost imperceptible grace. He paused briefly at the doorway, adjusting the folds of his tunic and inhaling the mingled aromas of bread, smoke, and the faint, lingering tang of the sea. Inside, the house exhaled its usual calm. Claudia had begun her afternoon routines, moving softly through the rooms with measured purpose. She tended to the laundry, arranging tunics and linens on the line so that the breeze could carry away dust and dampness, smoothing each garment with hands both careful and habitual. Flavia sat nearby, her small fingers playing with scraps of cloth, imitating in miniature the meticulous motions of her mother. Marcus had returned from lessons, his stylus tucked away, his mind full of letters, recitations, and the faint echo of Tiberius's voice guiding his every stroke. The courtyard was suffused with light, a quiet glow that softened the edges of stone and clay. Tilla moved about sweeping the floor, carrying water in small amphorae to rinse the pots and dishes left from breakfast. Gaius, the cook, began preparing a simple midday meal, stirring a pot of barley and lentils while keeping one eye on the oven for fresh bread. There was a rhythm to all these movements, a subtle choreography that spoke of experience, of quiet attentiveness, of lives lived in measured repetition. Lucius settled himself on a low bench in the atrium, feeling the warmth of the sun as it touched his shoulders. He allowed himself a brief rest, closing his eyes just long enough to feel the pulse of the household. The soft sweep of the broom, the gentle clatter of pottery, the faint murmur of children's voices. It was in these quiet moments, between the demands of commerce and the constant motion of the city, that the ordinariness of life revealed its subtle beauty. Claudia approached with a small cup of watered wine and a fragment of bread, setting them carefully on a nearby table. She spoke little, only enough to acknowledge his presence, her movements precise and economical. Lucius accepted the offering with a faint nod, tasting the bread, noting the texture and the warmth, appreciating the comfort of simple nourishment after the labor of the morning. Meanwhile, the children engaged themselves with small, ordered activities. Marcus practiced a few sums in his mind, recalling the calculations from the market, imagining the cost of the amphorae and the value of his labor. Flavia arranged stones and shells in a careful sequence on the courtyard floor, her imagination turning them into roads, walls, and distant landscapes she had never seen but conjured vividly within her mind. Each movement, however trivial it might seem, was a lesson in order, in observation, and in the quiet acquisition of skill. Gaius hummed a low tune as he stirred the cooking pot, the sound blending with the soft rustle of linen on the line and the distant calls of merchants in the streets. The city continued its constant murmur outside, a background that was both comforting and grounding. Lucius watched the shadows lengthen across the floor, noting the way light fell through the open atrium, marking the passage of hours without haste, without urgency, without notice, simply marking the rhythm of existence. Claudia paused to adjust a piece of pottery that had been shifted by the breeze, her fingers brushing over the smooth clay with careful affection. She glanced toward Lucius, her eyes briefly meeting his with a quiet understanding. the shared knowledge of a life built upon careful attention, upon small, almost invisible acts that maintained the household and, by extension, the continuity of family and city alike. Time moved on, marked by the shifting light, the faint scent of cooking, and the soft, repeated tasks that defined Roman domesticity. Lucius reflected upon the subtle balance of the day, the morning spent in the market, the negotiation of goods and information, and now the quiet return to home, to the duties that required attention but demanded little recognition. There was satisfaction in these ordinary labors, a quiet acknowledgement that life's enduring beauty resided not in grandeur or spectacle, but in continuity, in observation, in participation in the delicate rhythm of daily existence. As the afternoon waned, the household prepared for the next phase, the arrival of merchants or neighbors, the small errands that required attention, and the slow preparation for the midday meal. Lucius felt a gentle weariness, the kind born not of exertion, but of attentiveness, of being fully present in the quiet currents of life that moved through his family, his home, and the city beyond. In this soft interlude between morning and midday, he observed the household as though it were a living organism. The children, the servants, Claudia, Gaius, all moving in a delicate, intertwined rhythm. And in that observation, he felt the subtle satisfaction that came from understanding, however fleetingly, the invisible threads that connected one ordinary day to the endless cycle of life in Ostia, where the ordinary and the eternal quietly entwined. As the afternoon sun softened into a gentler glow, Claudia moved through the house with the quiet authority that marked her presence. The household hummed around her. Tilla sweeping, Gaius tending the pot, Marcus pausing in his lessons, and Flavia arranging her stones and scraps of fabric in patterns that mirrored her imagination. Yet, Claudia's influence was subtle, invisible to any who did not understand the delicate web she wove through domestic life. She governed not by loud command but by measured attention, by anticipation of needs, and by a constant awareness of the world beyond the walls of the domus. Claudia's tasks were many, and each required a combination of patience, foresight, and precision. She checked the amphory of oil, making sure none were cracked or leaking. She measured out portions of grain for the next meal, knowing exactly how much each member of the household would consume, accounting for the cook's estimations and the children's unpredictable appetites. She adjusted the lines of laundry, arranging tunics and sheets so that each would dry evenly, aware that even the slightest oversight could lead to uneven drying, faded colors, or wrinkles that would draw gentle criticism from Lucius. Her influence extended beyond the material. She observed Marcus and Flavia carefully, noticing the small gestures that revealed temperament, curiosity, or mischief. When Marcus tilted his head too far or hesitated over a word, she would guide him subtly, reminding him with a quiet word or a gentle touch. When Flavia became distracted, Claudia's soft admonitions were more an invitation to focus than a correction, shaping her daughter's developing character with a patient, almost invisible hand. Outside, the city continued its constant murmur. The clatter of carts, the occasional shout of a vendor, the sound of sailors checking rigging along the docks. Claudia thought often of this world beyond the home, the wider social web in which she existed quietly but deliberately. Women of her standing rarely left the household, yet they shaped the household's relationship to the city, guided servants, maintained connections with neighbors, and ensured that domestic order remained uninterrupted. It was a subtle power, wielded with care, observed only by those patient enough to notice. She paused at the small herb garden in the courtyard, brushing leaves gently to inspect their growth. Parsley, coriander, rue, and fennel thrived under her careful attention. She plucked a few leaves for the midday meal, knowing that each subtle addition would enhance flavor, demonstrate attentiveness, and reflect her diligence. Even in small acts like this, Claudia exercised agency, shaping the experience of the household with quiet, imperceptible authority. In the corner, Flavia's play continued. Claudia watched without interrupting, recognizing the importance of imagination as a teacher in its own right. Each arrangement of stones, each pattern created from scraps, was a rehearsal for understanding order, consequence, and patience, lessons as important as any received from a teacher or parent. Marcus, too, received her glances of encouragement, subtle acknowledgments that reinforced his learning without disrupting it. When Tilla approached with a message from a neighbor or a small errand, Claudia gave instructions in a low, steady voice. Nothing was hurried. Everything was anticipated. The rhythm of her words, her gestures, and her attention carried authority, ensuring that the household functioned smoothly, even in moments when Lucius was away or occupied. She maintained the pulse of life in the domus, observing patterns, predicting outcomes, and intervening only when necessary, all while preserving the delicate balance that allowed family and servants to coexist in harmony. Claudia's reflection often extended to the community beyond her home. She knew which neighbors relied on her assistance, who needed advice on household matters, who could be trusted with small confidences. She navigated this network with skill, providing counsel, sharing resources, and offering reassurance. All subtle, all without fanfare, all reinforcing the invisible fabric of society that connected families, neighborhoods, and the city itself. As the light in the atrium shifted toward the cooler tones of late afternoon, Claudia returned briefly to the kitchen to check on Gaius and the preparations for the next meal. She moved with deliberate ease, her eyes noticing cracks in a jar, a faint overcooking of barley, a misalignment of the tableware. Each correction was quiet, unobtrusive, but essential. In these moments, she exercised the subtle power of foresight, ensuring that daily life continued without disruption, that small errors did not accumulate into disorder, and that the household maintained its rhythm, grace, and dignity. Evening was approaching, though it would not arrive for several hours. Claudia took a moment in the courtyard, inhaling the mingled scents of herbs, warm stone, and distant salt from the harbor. She watched the light fall across the mosaic floor, noticing the way shadows stretched and softened, and she allowed herself a brief reflection, a quiet acknowledgement of the work done, the order maintained, and the subtle influence she had exerted over the lives within the domus. In this quiet, measured world, Claudia's life unfolded with dignity, discipline, and silent authority, revealing the profound importance of ordinary acts performed with attention, care, and patience. She shaped not only her family, but the rhythm of the household, the temperament of children, and the subtle connections that held Ostia's social fabric together, a quiet power that often went unnoticed yet endured in its effects. As the sun slowly shifted toward the west, casting longer, softer shadows across the courtyard, the household settled into the quiet cadence of afternoon. Lucius returned from the market, his mind half occupied with the day's transactions, the weight of amphory carried by his servants, and the subtle notes of gossip overheard among the traders. Even now, the murmur of the city, distant voices, clattering carts, and the occasional bray of a donkey drifted faintly through the open doorways, a reminder of life continuing beyond the walls of the domus. Inside, Claudia orchestrated the movements of her household with quiet precision. Tilla carried fresh water from the fountain in small amphory, each step measured so as not to spill a single drop. She poured it slowly into the cooking pots while Claudia added herbs, tasting carefully, nodding, and adjusting quantities with minimal words. The aroma of the barley and lentils mingled with olive oil, a scent both familiar and comforting, carrying the subtle promise of nourishment and domestic order. Marcus sat at the small table, attempting to commit additional lessons to memory. He repeated lines of poetry under his breath, the wax tablet beside him inscribed with neat, deliberate letters. Each stroke of the stylus mirrored the patience of his mother's movements in the kitchen, the steady, deliberate rhythm of their daily life. Occasionally, he glanced at Lucius, seeking approval in a subtle, unspoken way, and received only the faintest nod, a signal that he was on the right path. Flavia wandered nearby, her play still imaginative but now slightly more structured, arranging shells, stones, and scraps of pottery into small sequences that mimicked streets, buildings, and distant landscapes. Claudia occasionally corrected a tilt or rearranged a cluster of stones, her interventions gentle but precise, teaching patience and careful observation without disrupting the child's creativity. Flavia's small eyes sparkled with delight as she incorporated these subtle suggestions into her designs, understanding, even if unconsciously, the quiet discipline of home life. Lucius moved among them, reviewing the ledgers of his trade. He calculated the cost of the oil shipment, subtracted the expenses of transportation, noted debts owed by clients, and considered the timing of the next market visit. Each number on the wax tablet represented more than just commerce. It carried the weight of planning, trust, and foresight, the invisible threads that linked his household to the wider economy of Ostia. He paused occasionally to look at the children, at Claudia's careful management of the kitchen, and at the steady work of Tilla and Gaius, feeling the subtle satisfaction of observing a well-ordered household functioning as a single, harmonious organism. Outside, the city continued its gentle rhythm. Sailors argued quietly over the placement of cargo on the docks. Vendors discussed the arrival of ships, and children ran along narrow alleys, their laughter intertwining with the occasional bray of a donkey. The distant hum of the harbor seemed to echo in the walls of the home, a reminder that life outside moved according to its own unpredictable patterns, even as inside, routine and discipline held firm. Lucius paused for a moment, placing a hand on the table and allowing his thoughts to wander. He considered the subtle complexity of daily life, how each small action, a properly swept floor, a well-placed stitch, a correctly measured amphora of oil, contributed to the stability of the household. Each act of care, each measured movement, was a thread in the intricate fabric of family, commerce, and social cohesion. He felt the weight of this continuity as profoundly as he felt the heat of the afternoon sun on his shoulders. Claudia continued her work, her hands moving swiftly and silently, correcting minor errors, tasting food, adjusting cloth, and observing the children. There was an elegance to her attentiveness, a quiet authority that maintained both order and grace. She understood instinctively that the success of the household depended not on grand gestures, but on countless small decisions executed with care, patience, and unwavering attention. The household settled into a pattern. Marcus studying, Flavia playing, Gaius preparing the next meal, Tilla moving quietly about, and Claudia supervising with gentle authority. Lucius continued his accounting, pausing occasionally to adjust a calculation or to watch the sunlight shift across the mosaic floor. In these quiet hours, the rhythm of life revealed itself fully, a seamless blend of work, learning, care, and observation that defined the ordinary yet enduring beauty of Roman domesticity. As shadows deepened and the afternoon waned, the household prepared for the transition into evening. Meals were set aside briefly, chores paused, and a subtle calm fell over the rooms. Lucius glanced once more at his family, appreciating the ordinary, persistent grace of their actions, the subtle cohesion that held them together, and the quiet satisfaction of a day unfolding without disruption. The ordinary, in this moment, felt profound, a reminder that the endurance of family, of city, of life itself, relied on the steady, patient rhythm of countless small gestures, repeated and perfected across generations. As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, The golden light softened to a gentle amber, filtering through the open windows and doors of the domus. Shadows stretched across the mosaic floor, elongating and merging until the atrium seemed a quiet stage for the final act of the day. Lucius stood briefly in the doorway, adjusting his tunic, feeling the cool breeze waft in from the harbor and carrying with it the faint, salty scent of the sea. The city beyond the walls had begun its slow transition from the bustling rhythm of day to the gentler cadence of evening, and within the household, a similar shift quietly unfolded. Claudia moved with deliberate grace, checking the preparations for the evening meal. A small pot of lentils simmered over the fire, emitting a soft, earthy aroma that mingled with the faint fragrance of baked bread resting on the sideboard. She adjusted the placement of plates and cups, ensuring that each item was in order, anticipating not only the family's needs but the subtle gestures of care that signified attentiveness and respect. Tilla carried fresh water from the fountain, her steps careful as always, while Gaius checked the pots and adjusted the fire, ensuring that the cooking progressed evenly. Marcus sat at his small desk, reviewing the lines of poetry he had practiced earlier, his stylus tapping softly on the wax tablet. The quiet scratching of letters was accompanied by the distant murmur of the city and the faint shuffle of household activity. He paused now and then to glance at Lucius, seeking approval through a subtle look or the slightest nod, learning not only letters and numbers but the unspoken rhythms of attention, observation, and discretion. Flavia, sitting on a mat in the corner of the courtyard, arranged small stones into intricate patterns, her imagination constructing miniature streets and homes. Claudia occasionally reached down to adjust a stone or offer a suggestion, her guidance gentle and barely perceptible, shaping her daughter's focus without stifling creativity. The interplay of observation, correction, and encouragement created an invisible structure in the household, a rhythm of quiet authority, care, and teaching that held the family together with subtle, enduring strength. Lucius sat at the low bench near the atrium, reviewing his accounts and reflecting on the day. The morning had been spent negotiating at the market, observing transactions, and confirming shipments of oil and other goods. The afternoon had unfolded with domestic chores, children's lessons, and the quiet choreography of household life. Now, in the calm of evening, he allowed himself to notice the small details, the warmth of the fire, the shifting light across the tiles, the faint scent of herbs carried from the courtyard garden. These details, ordinary in isolation, coalesced into the enduring pattern of family life, quiet yet profoundly sustaining. Claudia moved toward Lucius with a small cup of watered wine and a modest portion of bread, setting them gently on the table. Her eyes met his briefly, a silent acknowledgement of shared labor, care, and attention. Lucius accepted the offering with a faint nod, tasting the wine, feeling the warmth spread, and noting the subtle sweetness of the bread. These simple rituals, repeated countless times, marked the rhythm of the household as surely as the movement of the sun or the distant tolling of a temple bell. Outside, the sounds of Ostia began to change. Merchants and sailors gradually withdrew from the streets, carts returned to stables, and the cries of children playing faded into the distance. The harbor settled into a low murmur, the gentle lapping of waves against moored ships, the occasional call from a sailor, and the distant hum of the city adjusting to evening. The household seemed to absorb these rhythms, responding with its own quiet adjustments. Pots moved, floors swept, stones arranged, and lessons reviewed. As the day wound down, Claudia and Lucius found a moment together in the courtyard, sitting quietly on a low stone bench. They spoke little, but the conversation flowed in subtler ways. A glance toward the children, a word about the day's chores, a shared observation of the city beyond the walls. Even in silence, they communicated the depth of their shared labor, the attention to detail, and the quiet satisfaction of maintaining order, care, and continuity. The light gradually softened into a muted orange, then faded into dusky violet, shadows merging with the dim glow of oil lamps now lit around the atrium. Marcus and Flavia moved toward the small inner rooms, finishing their activities as instructed. Tilla and Gaius prepared the final touches for the evening meal, their motions steady and almost ritualistic, carrying the quiet authority and rhythm of countless previous days. Lucius reflected on the subtle poetry of domestic life, the constant, often unnoticed work, the gentle guidance of Claudia, the attentive care of servants, the growth and learning of the children, and the quiet rhythm of the city beyond. In these ordinary moments, he found the extraordinary. The enduring continuity of life, the invisible threads connecting family, household, and city, and the sense of stability and purpose that wove together one ordinary day after another. As darkness settled and stars began to glimmer faintly in the sky, the household paused together, a quiet congregation of activity and observation, of care and attentiveness. The city's distant hum merged with the soft crackle of the hearth, and Lucius allowed himself to sit back, observing, breathing, reflecting, and appreciating the ordinary splendor of a Roman evening, ordinary yet profound in its silent, enduring rhythm. The evening meal was a quiet, deliberate affair, its rhythm shaped by years of repetition and subtle attention to order. The table, low and broad, had been arranged carefully by Claudia, each plate, cup, and piece of cutlery placed with precision. The faint aroma of barley, lentils, and fresh bread mingled with the lingering scent of herbs from the courtyard, creating an atmosphere both comforting and grounding. The soft flicker of oil lamps cast gentle shadows across the walls, shifting slowly as the flames danced and illuminating the faces of the household with warm, golden light. Lucius reclined slightly on his stool, tasting the food with an unhurried approach, mindful of the subtle textures and flavors. He listened quietly as Claudia spoke to the children, guiding their attention toward proper manners, careful speech, and the unspoken codes of social behavior that were as vital as any lesson in letters or numbers. Marcus chewed thoughtfully, repeating lines of poetry softly under his breath, while Flavia picked delicately at the lentils, her eyes bright with curiosity as she experimented with arranging small morsels on her plate before eating. Conversation flowed slowly, almost imperceptibly, a series of exchanges carefully modulated to teach observation, patience, and attentiveness. Lucius inquired about Marcus's lessons, asking gently about the new words he had learned, the letters practiced, and the subtle nuances of pronunciation. Marcus answered with measured care, aware that his father's attention was both encouragement and assessment, that each response carried the weight of subtle approval or correction. Claudia guided Flavia with similar quiet attention, asking her about the stones and shells she had arranged in the courtyard, encouraging descriptions of imagined streets and distant landscapes. Each question invited thought, reflection, and creativity, yet also reinforced patience, attentiveness, and the understanding that small acts, arranging, observing, describing, carried significance. Flavia's responses, sometimes hesitant, sometimes playful, were met with gentle encouragement, fostering both independence and the subtle structure of guidance. The servants, Tilla and Gaius, moved quietly around the table, attending to minor needs, refilling cups, offering small morsels, adjusting plates. Their movements were unhurried yet precise, a quiet choreography that maintained the rhythm of the household and ensured that each person's needs were met without disruption. Their presence was both practical and instructive, demonstrating the unspoken order that underpinned the household's functioning. Outside, the sounds of Ostia had softened. The day's bustle receded, replaced by the distant lap of waves against moored ships, the occasional creak of a cart returning to stables, and the faint murmur of voices walking through narrow alleys. This softer backdrop framed the intimate quiet of the household, its rhythms contained yet connected to the larger pulse of the city. Lucius reflected on the subtle lessons embedded in such evenings. The importance of patience in conversation, the cultivation of careful listening, the recognition of effort and thought in others. He understood that these small interactions, questions, answers, observations, and gentle guidance were as essential as the tangible provisions of food or the instruction of lessons. They shaped character, strengthened bonds, and reinforced the invisible structures that held the family together. As the meal concluded, Claudia guided the children through the small ritual of clearing the table, collecting plates and cups, and returning them to the kitchen. Marcus and Flavia learned, through repetition and gentle instruction, the importance of responsibility and contribution to the household, the unspoken understanding that each member, however small, played a vital role in the continuity and order of family life. Lucius lingered at the table for a few moments longer, tasting a last piece of bread, observing the flickering light, and allowing the quiet satisfaction of the day to settle upon him. There was a profound sense of continuity in these ordinary acts. The food prepared and eaten, the lessons practiced, the conversations conducted with care, and the attention to detail that sustained both domestic order and family cohesion. Evening deepened into night, and the household began the gentle transition toward rest. The children moved toward their small sleeping spaces. Tilla and Gaius prepared the house for the coming hours, and Claudia and Lucius shared a quiet moment of reflection, seated together in the courtyard where the faint scent of herbs mingled with the night air. The distant harbor lights shimmered across the water, echoing faintly in the quiet streets of Ostia, reminding them that life beyond the domus continued in its own rhythm, while inside, the household rested in careful, deliberate harmony. The ordinary moments, subtle yet profound, had shaped the day. The work, the lessons, the care, and the quiet bonds of family. And in these moments, Lucius, Claudia, Marcus, and Flavia found a sense of stability, purpose, and connection that would carry them through the nights, into the next day, and into the unfolding continuity of their lives in Ostia. Night settled over Ostia with a slow, deliberate weight, drawing shadows long across streets and courtyards and softening the harsh edges of stone and tile. The city beyond the walls of the domus grew quieter, the cries of vendors and the clatter of carts fading into the distant hum of the harbor, the gentle lapping of water against moored ships, the occasional creak of rigging, and the faint voices of sailors or late travelers. Within the house, a softer rhythm emerged, the quiet pulse of family and household settling into evening's calm. Claudia guided Marcus and Flavia to their small sleeping spaces. She moved deliberately, adjusting blankets, arranging pillows, and whispering gentle instructions that balanced care and discipline. Marcus hesitated over the reading of a short verse from the tablet he had practiced earlier, while Flavia's eyes lingered on the shadows in the corner of the room, their shapes forming patterns that her imagination quickly transformed into tiny towns, distant hills, and ships sailing toward unknown horizons. Lucius watched for a moment, quietly observing, his gaze noting the soft light from an oil lamp flickering across the walls. There was a subtle poetry in these routines. The way Claudia's hands moved with precision, the children responding to her guidance, the servants moving silently in the background. Each gesture, however ordinary, carried lessons in attentiveness, patience, respect, and the quiet navigation of the world both inside and outside the domus. As the children settled, Claudia told stories, quiet narratives of Ostia's streets, of the harbor, and of distant cities along the coast. Her voice was calm, measured, weaving tales that included merchants' triumphs and failures, rumors of stormed ships, whispers of travelers' adventures, and legends passed down through generations. Marcus listened intently, imagining the bustling markets and towering ships, the smells of spices and oil, and the sounds of coins clinking in distant towns. Flavia, her small fingers clutching a favorite cloth doll, pictured the same streets and ships, translating them into the patterns of her own imagination. Lucius sat nearby, reflecting quietly on the day. The market, the accounts, the household chores, and the meal had all been exercises in observation, judgment, and care. Now, as darkness fell and the city's distant hum persisted, he allowed himself to ponder the subtle currents of life that connected household, city, and family. He thought of merchants negotiating quietly, of neighbors exchanging greetings or small advice, and of sailors observing tides and wind patterns with patient expertise. Each thread, he realized, was part of a larger tapestry that sustained Ostia and those who lived within it. Outside, the moon rose over the harbor, casting silver reflections across the water. The ships rocked gently at their moorings, and faint voices carried over the distance. A sailor discussing a delayed cargo, a small dog barking at the edge of a street, a late traveler hurrying through a narrow alley. These sounds, filtered through the walls of the domus, became part of the rhythm of the household, blending seamlessly with the quieter, domestic activities of the evening. Claudia paused in the doorway, glancing at Lucius. Their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of shared responsibility, effort, and care. In that glance lay the unspoken understanding of continuity. The house maintained, the children guided, the family protected, and life in Ostia observed and navigated with patience and quiet authority. It was ordinary, yet profound, routine, yet sustaining, small, yet infinitely significant. Tilla and Gaius completed their evening duties, tidying utensils, ensuring the fire was controlled, and attending to minor tasks that preserved order. The faint crackle of the hearth and the scent of embers combined with the soft scent of herbs and cooking to create an ambience of calm and quiet security. Each member of the household, from the smallest child to the adults, participated in this gentle choreography of evening care. As the children finally drifted into sleep, their imaginations filled with the sights and stories of Ostia, Lucius and Claudia remained in the courtyard for a final moment. They inhaled the cool night air, listening to the subtle sounds of the city and harbor, feeling the continuity of life around and within them. The ordinary motions of the day, work, observation, conversation, care, had rippled into the evening, shaping character, strengthening bonds, and ensuring that the household remained a small, enduring world in the midst of a larger, ever-moving city. Night deepened, oil lamps flickered low, and the household settled fully into quiet. Outside, Ostia slept unevenly, yet within the walls of the domus, there was harmony. The gentle rhythm of life, sustained by observation, patience, and care, continuing unbroken from one day into the next, and from one generation to another. The ordinary, repeated carefully and attentively, carried within it a profound and enduring beauty that few outside could ever perceive, yet all within understood intimately. The house lay in near-perfect stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of timber, the faint shifting of Tilla or Gaius making final checks, or the quiet breathing of sleeping children. Lucius remained seated on a low stone bench in the courtyard, the cool night air brushing his shoulders and carrying the faint scent of salt from the harbor. The stars above glimmered faintly, reflected on the calm surface of the water, and the city beyond the walls seemed to breathe with a slow, unhurried rhythm, almost as though Ostia itself had paused to consider its own reflection. In the deep quiet, Lucius allowed his thoughts to wander. The day's transactions at the market had followed their predictable yet subtle patterns. Careful observation, negotiation, the weighing of goods and trust, and the navigation of rumor and opportunity. Each interaction had been minor in isolation, but together, they formed a web that sustained his household and his place within the wider city. He thought about the subtle influences of his neighbors, the movements of merchants, and the unpredictable behavior of sailors whose livelihoods were tied to winds and tides. In all of it, he sensed the careful balance of order and uncertainty, of routine and chance, which defined life in Ostia. The soft glow of oil lamps inside the house cast gentle reflections on the mosaic floor of the courtyard. Claudia had returned inside, leaving the courtyard for a brief moment of solitude. Lucius considered the quiet authority she wielded, the invisible threads that connected her attentiveness to the household's harmony. She had guided the children, coordinated the servants, and maintained order through gentle oversight, demonstrating that the power of patience, observation, and careful action was often more profound than any loud declaration. Outside, the harbor continued its subdued nighttime rhythm. Ships rocked faintly at their moorings, a lone sailor adjusted a rope, and a distant lantern bobbed as someone navigated a narrow alley. Each sound, faint yet persistent, reminded Lucius of the continuity of life beyond the household, of the city's pulse that never truly ceased even when most humans rested. He found comfort in these sounds, reminders that he and his family were participants in something larger, connected to a city whose quiet rhythms mirrored the subtle, enduring patterns of domestic life. His gaze wandered to the small herb garden in the courtyard, where parsley, fennel, and rue shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Claudia's care had nurtured them, just as her attentiveness had shaped the household. Lucius allowed himself a quiet appreciation of these small, ordinary continuities. A plant thriving in a carefully tended patch of soil, a child learning through play, a servant completing duties with conscientiousness, a day observed and accounted for with attention. In these details, he perceived the slow, enduring pulse of life itself. Memories of childhood drifted into his thoughts. Mornings spent running along stone streets, afternoons learning letters, evenings listening to stories by candlelight. He realized how much these early rhythms had influenced his own approach to family, trade, and observation. The ordinary patterns of daily life had shaped not only skills and knowledge, but also the ability to perceive subtle connections, to anticipate consequences, and to navigate human behavior with patience and care. Lucius noted a distant conversation, carried faintly from the streets. Two men discussing a delayed shipment, the faint clink of coins, the hushed tones of secrets exchanged. He considered how rumor, like wind, traveled through the city, touching lives quietly, subtly influencing actions and decisions. Life in Ostia was as much about perception, patience, and timing as it was about action. Each person, consciously or not, contributed to the web of observation and understanding that allowed the city to function smoothly, sustaining commerce, family, and community. He reflected further on his children. Marcus, with his quiet diligence, learning both letters and the subtleties of human observation. Flavia, with her vivid imagination, practicing the art of creation, organization, and attention to detail through play. Each moment, each small act of learning or imagination would ripple outward, shaping character, judgment, and the ability to participate thoughtfully in the larger world. Claudia's influence, gentle yet omnipresent, reinforced these lessons, ensuring that the household functioned as both school and sanctuary. Lucius exhaled slowly, letting his thoughts settle like dust in the night air. He understood that the ordinary hours, observed with care, contained their own subtle magic, the creation of order, the cultivation of character, and the quiet weaving of continuity that bound household, family, and city together. The night was a vessel of reflection, a pause that allowed him to perceive patterns invisible during the busy day, and to appreciate the quiet profundity of ordinary life. The courtyard felt suspended between time and eternity, Shadows deepened, the scent of herbs mingled with faint smoke from the hearth, and the distant hum of the harbor continued its slow rhythm. Lucius felt the enduring comfort of observation, of patience, and of continuity, knowing that these invisible threads connected him, his family, and Ostia itself across days, years, and generations. Night deepened fully, and finally Lucius rose, stretching quietly, preparing to join his family indoors. Even in sleep, he understood. The household would continue its quiet rhythms, guided by Claudia's attentiveness and by the subtle, enduring patterns he had helped sustain through observation and care. Life in Ostia, ordinary yet profound, persisted, measured in minutes, breaths, and the gentle, invisible flow of existence. Dawn arrived slowly over Ostia, the horizon tinged with pale orange and the faintest whispers of pink, signaling the quiet awakening of the city. The air was cool and carried a faint saltiness from the harbor, mixed with the scent of wet stone and the lingering aroma of bread from bakeries already tending their ovens. Lucius stirred first, opening the shutters to let the morning light spill into the atrium, noticing the gentle dance of shadows on the mosaic floor and the distant silhouette of ships anchored in the harbor. The household began its subtle morning rhythm. Claudia moved quietly, adjusting the sleeping children's blankets, checking the hearth, and preparing small amounts of water for washing faces and hands. Marcus stirred, blinking against the soft light, while Flavia rubbed her eyes and yawned, already eager to explore the courtyard with her usual curiosity. The children's movements were slow, deliberate, shaped by habit and the gentle guidance of Claudia, who ensured that even waking was conducted with a sense of order and care. Tilla carried a small pitcher of water from the fountain, filling basins for washing, while Gaius arranged the kitchen for the preparation of the morning meal. The soft clatter of pottery, the faint splash of water, and the rhythmic movement of servants harmonized with the distant sounds of Ostia coming to life. The scraping of carts along stone streets, muted calls of early vendors, and the creaking of rigging on ships preparing for the day's departures. Lucius, fully awake now, took a moment to breathe in the morning air, noting the subtle signs of the city's awakening. Merchants were arranging stalls, sailors were tending ropes, and the first hints of activity rippled through the harbor. He considered the day ahead: deliveries to check, ledgers to review, goods to negotiate, and the delicate balance of trade to maintain. Yet he also appreciated the serenity of the early morning, a quiet interlude before the demands of day fully asserted themselves. Claudia guided Marcus and Flavia through their morning routines, washing, dressing, and attending to small chores within the household. Marcus practiced a few lines of writing on his wax tablet, tracing letters carefully, while Flavia collected small items from the courtyard, stones, shells, and scraps of cloth, arranging them in miniature representations of the streets and ships she had seen or imagined. Even these simple acts carried lessons: attention, observation, patience, and an understanding of space, sequence, and consequence. The household meal was prepared with the same quiet attention as the previous evening. Bread was sliced and warmed, lentils and vegetables were arranged in simple portions, and the children ate slowly, guided by subtle instructions in manners and conversation. Lucius and Claudia observed, occasionally guiding, occasionally correcting, always teaching through example and gentle direction. The aroma of herbs, the warmth of the fire, and the calm rhythm of preparation created a space where the ordinary act of eating became a lesson in attentiveness, care, and harmony. Outside, Ostia fully awakened. Merchants called out to potential customers. Sailors shouted to one another across the docks. Carts rumbled over stone streets, and the faint cries of children echoed along alleys. Lucius observed the city as he walked toward the door, noting the subtle interactions that determine trust, exchange, and reputation. Every movement, every glance, every word carried significance. Even the smallest misstep could ripple across transactions, relationships, and daily routines. As the family completed breakfast, Claudia reminded the children of lessons and tasks for the morning. Marcus would practice more writing and recount stories from his studies, while Flavia continued her imaginative explorations in the courtyard. Tilla and Gaius tidied the kitchen, prepared provisions for later meals, and attended to small, persistent duties that ensured order and continuity. The domus thrummed with quiet efficiency, a microcosm of the city's larger rhythm, sustained by attention, diligence, and the careful choreography of life. Lucius stepped outside, feeling the cool morning air, smelling the faint tang of fish from the harbor, and listening to the gentle murmur of awakening streets. He considered the continuity of days like this, each following a rhythm that balanced work, care, observation, and interaction. Even in the ordinary, he perceived the extraordinary, the delicate interplay of human action, anticipation, and consequence that defined both household and city. By mid-morning, the household had fully transitioned into its daily routines. Marcus and Flavia were engaged in lessons and play, Claudia supervised and guided with subtle authority, and Lucius prepared to venture toward the market, carrying not only goods and ledgers but also the invisible responsibility of sustaining his family, maintaining trust, and navigating the intricate web of Ostia's social and commercial life. The day had begun, ordinary yet full of intricate detail, carrying forward the patterns that would define not only this day but countless others in the life of a Roman family. Lucius stepped onto the stone-paved streets of Ostia as the morning sunlight fell over the city, highlighting the terracotta rooftops, the mosaic doorways, and the bustling crowds that moved with purpose and familiarity. The harbor emitted its usual medley of sounds: creaking ships, shouting sailors, distant gulls calling over the water, and the low hum of merchants arranging their wares. Every corner of the marketplace carried an energy both chaotic and meticulously ordered, a rhythm that Lucius had come to know intimately through years of participation. The stalls stretched out in a colorful array, filled with pottery, olive oil amphory, dried fish, woven fabrics, and baskets of fresh fruit. Merchants called to one another across the paths, negotiating deals in soft murmurs or raised voices, gauging attention, trust, and opportunity in equal measure. Lucius moved carefully, observing interactions not only for profit but also for subtle signs of character. Hesitation in a hand, a flicker of the eye, the tone of a voice. Every detail contributed to a larger understanding of human behavior and commerce, knowledge as critical as counting coins or weighing goods. He approached a familiar olive oil vendor, examining the consistency of the product while exchanging measured greetings. The vendor, aware of Lucius's keen eye, offered samples, noting the subtle changes in hue or aroma that might indicate quality or freshness. Lucius tasted the oil with practiced attention, noting the slight bitterness of early harvest and the smoothness of pressed fruit. Each assessment carried implications for his household, his business, and the relationships he maintained within the market. Nearby, a group of fishmongers argued quietly over the weight of a shipment, each careful not to reveal too much while ensuring that claims were taken seriously. Lucius watched and listened, parsing meaning from tone, gesture, and timing, recognizing that even disputes contained lessons in negotiation, patience, and strategic observation. The market, he understood, was a microcosm of the larger city, a web of trust, subtle power, and perpetual negotiation. As he moved deeper into the marketplace, Lucius exchanged greetings with other merchants, noting arrivals from the countryside, the condition of transported goods, and the ebb and flow of customers. Each interaction required attention not only to numbers and commodities but also to relationships, reputation, and the quiet understanding of human nature. A smile, a frown, a hesitation. These were as significant as the weight of a sack of grain or the price of an amphora of oil. Lucius paused to consider a shipment of imported wine arriving from the southern provinces. The barrels were carefully stacked, some labeled with intricate markings indicating origin and vintage. He observed the men unloading them, noting skill, fatigue, and precision, recognizing that their work, though routine, was vital to the continuity of trade and trust. The subtle care with which each barrel was handled mirrored the care he applied in his own household. Attention to detail, anticipation of consequences, and the quiet responsibility of stewardship. Throughout the morning, Lucius continued to navigate this intricate environment, purchasing, negotiating, and observing. He assessed not only commodities but also human behavior, a merchant's confidence, a customer's hesitation, the subtle influence of gossip, and the shifting tides of supply and demand. Each decision, each interaction, reinforced the understanding that commerce was inseparable from perception, patience, and careful judgment. By mid-morning, Lucius had completed much of his market business. Amphorae and sacks of goods were accounted for, arrangements made for delivery, and subtle observations noted for future consideration. He reflected briefly on the interplay of diligence, observation, and relationship building that defined his trade, appreciating the invisible threads connecting his household to the market, the harbor, and the broader city. As he prepared to return home, Lucius allowed himself a moment to observe the marketplace as a whole. The rhythm of footsteps, the calls of merchants, the careful weighing of goods, and the subtle exchanges of information. Ostia thrived not merely on the movement of goods, but on the continuous interplay of observation, judgment, and quiet attention to detail. The city, like his household, depended on these subtle patterns, often unnoticed, yet essential for continuity and harmony. With the morning's tasks complete, Lucius made his way back through winding streets toward the Domus, carrying both tangible goods and the intangible knowledge gleaned from careful observation. Each step resonated with the rhythm of the city, a steady pulse that mirrored the quiet, disciplined life of his household, connecting home and marketplace, family and community, in the ongoing weave of ordinary yet profoundly intricate existence. Lucius returned to the Domus just as the sun reached its zenith, the heat settling into the stone streets of Ostia and bathing the city in a golden glare. The harbor shimmered faintly in the distance, reflecting the sunlight across rippling water, while merchants' voices drifted through the narrow alleys, tempered now by the slower rhythm of midday. Within the walls of the household, a different cadence prevailed, calm, measured, and quietly persistent, like a pulse that sustained life in its ordinary yet essential motions. Claudia was already moving through the rooms, supervising the small domestic tasks that required attention before the afternoon meal. Tilla carried fresh water from the courtyard fountain, carefully balancing amphorae to avoid spills, while Gaius tended to the kitchen fire, adjusting its intensity for cooking later in the day. Marcus sat at the table, reviewing his morning's lessons, while Flavia arranged stones, shells, and scraps of fabric into intricate patterns on the floor, creating miniature representations of streets, docks, and imagined ships that traced her fleeting thoughts. The household hummed with quiet efficiency. Claudia's eyes flicked to each movement, the careful placement of a cup, the tilt of a stone, the straightness of letters on Marcus's wax tablet. She guided subtly, never commanding, her presence a gentle influence that maintained order and cultivated attentiveness. Even small corrections carried lessons. A glance, a touch, a softly spoken word teaching care, observation, and the patience required to navigate life's ordinary tasks. Lucius observed briefly before beginning to sort through the goods he had brought from the market. Amphorae of oil were inspected carefully, their seals checked, and barrels of wine positioned for storage. Each action, though ordinary, carried a weight of responsibility. One misstep could compromise quality, trust, or future transactions. Yet he moved with ease, guided by experience, and watched the household settle around him like a well-rehearsed rhythm, each member contributing in subtle, essential ways. The courtyard, warmed by the sun, became a center of quiet activity. Flavia rearranged her miniature streets while Marcus practiced writing letters and reviewing lessons aloud under Claudia's gentle supervision. Tilla and Gaius moved among them, ensuring that cooking preparations proceeded without disruption, that utensils were in place, and that small chores were completed with attention and care. Even in ordinary, repetitive actions, the household maintained a sense of balance, a silent testament to discipline, foresight, and the subtle authority that guided each individual. Lucius paused to reflect on the interplay between domestic life and commerce. The market, bustling with negotiation, observation, and subtle judgment, seemed mirrored in miniature within the household. Small tasks, careful supervision, quiet observation, and the continuous shaping of behavior and attention. Each amphora checked, each stone aligned, each lesson recited was a microcosm of the broader patterns that allowed Ostia to function smoothly, invisible threads woven through ordinary moments. As the afternoon progressed, the kitchen became the center of measured activity. Claudia supervised the preparation of grains and vegetables, tasting, adjusting, and ensuring that portions were adequate yet not excessive. The children assisted in small ways. Marcus stirred gently, careful not to spill, while Flavia carried small bowls or placed utensils under Claudia's watchful eye. Even these tiny contributions carried lessons in responsibility, foresight, and attention to detail, reinforcing the household's invisible rhythm of cooperation and care. Outside, the city continued its slower midday pace. Sailors paused for brief meals, merchants rested in the shade of their stalls, and the hum of distant conversations softened. Within the household, time seemed to expand, each action deliberate, each movement weighted with purpose and attentiveness. Lucius appreciated this quiet interlude, observing the subtle coordination between family and servants, the invisible authority exercised by Claudia, and the way ordinary tasks carried lessons that extended far beyond the immediate moment. As the sun began its gradual descent toward the west, casting longer shadows across the courtyard, the household transitioned once more. Cooking preparations paused briefly, the children gathered lessons or arranged play materials, and Claudia moved from one task to another, always attentive, always anticipating needs before they arose. Lucius reflected on the enduring value of ordinary acts, repeated with care, patience, and awareness, a rhythm that sustained not only the household but the broader continuity of family, learning, and social connection. By late afternoon, the domus was prepared for the next stage of daily life. The meal, conversation, and subtle instruction that would unfold as the light softened and evening approached. Each person, from the smallest child to the most experienced servant, had participated in the quiet choreography of the day, a pattern that was ordinary, yet foundational and profoundly shaping in its repetition. Life in Ostia, as observed from within this small household, revealed itself not only in grand gestures or public events, but in the disciplined, attentive, and deliberate actions that connected one day to the next, sustaining continuity, harmony, and quiet dignity. As the afternoon waned, the light softened into a warm, golden hue, filtering through the open windows and doors of the domus, painting the mosaic floors and walls in shifting patterns of shadow and brightness. The city outside had adopted a gentler pace. Merchants were closing stalls or preparing for the evening trade. Sailors stretched and adjusted ropes on moored ships, and the distant hum of the harbor mingled with the soft calls of children playing in narrow alleys. Within the household, A rhythm of learning, observation, and quiet reflection began to unfold, linking domestic care with the subtler lessons of life itself. Marcus sat near the courtyard, wax tablet in hand, reviewing his writing lessons from the morning. Each line of letters demanded concentration. A steady hand, attention to spacing, careful observation of the shapes. Claudia moved among the household, occasionally glancing at the boy's work, offering the gentlest corrections with a quiet word or touch. Marcus learned not only to form letters but to observe, to anticipate mistakes, and to practice patience, a discipline extending far beyond the mere act of writing. Flavia wandered nearby, small fingers picking up stones, shells, and scraps of colored cloth. She arranged them into streets, buildings, and ships, building a miniature world that reflected her imagination, but also the real shapes she had seen during walks through the city or along the docks. Claudia, without interrupting, occasionally suggested a real-world adjustment. A path should curve gently, a ship might be oriented toward the harbor. Flavia absorbed these details, translating observation into creation, learning subtly the interplay of imagination and reality, order and artistry. Lucius, seated at the low bench near the atrium, allowed his gaze to drift outward, observing both household and city. The interactions in the marketplace earlier that morning had been instructive, revealing nuances in negotiation, subtle changes in trust, and the consequences of timing and perception. Now, watching the household, he recognized similar lessons applied on a smaller, more intimate scale. Patience, attentiveness, and the careful shaping of character through repeated, measured guidance. Each gesture, each correction, each quietly offered suggestion was a thread weaving continuity and understanding. Tilla and Gaius moved methodically, preparing provisions for the evening meal, tidying the kitchen, and attending to small household tasks that ensured order without drawing attention. Their work, though ordinary, demonstrated discipline, anticipation, and quiet responsibility. Each movement, measured and deliberate, contributed to the rhythm of the day, reinforcing lessons of care, consistency, and attentiveness for the children observing them, and sustaining the household's seamless functionality. The city beyond the walls murmured softly. Distant shouts from merchants, the faint clang of tools being stored for the day, footsteps on cobblestones, and the low murmur of conversations drifting down alleys. Lucius considered the interconnectedness of these sounds. Every voice, every movement, a subtle thread in the web of the city's continuity. Observing the household and city together, he understood that life was composed of countless overlapping patterns, each small yet critical to the endurance of both family and community. Claudia guided Marcus through a short reading exercise, asking him to recount a story he had learned from a wax tablet earlier in the week. He hesitated at a few words, pronounced others with care, and occasionally glanced toward his mother for reassurance. Each pause, correction, and repetition reinforced discipline, comprehension, and attentive listening. The exercise, though ordinary in form, contained lessons in responsibility, focus, and the careful modulation of speech, essential skills for participation in the broader social world of Ostia. Meanwhile, Flavia incorporated elements from the city into her imaginative play, drawing on observations of carts, streets, docks, and ships, weaving them seamlessly into her arrangements of stones and shells. Claudia's subtle guidance ensured that creativity remained structured, teaching both freedom of thought and the importance of order. In this quiet interaction, Flavia learned that observation and imagination were intertwined, that the world outside and the creations inside could coexist harmoniously, and that attention to detail carried as much weight as invention. Lucius reflected on these lessons, recognizing how domestic life mirrored the broader complexities of Ostia. Commerce, observation, social interaction, and responsibility. Each small, repeated act, a letter traced carefully, a stone placed thoughtfully, a meal prepared attentively, carried implications far beyond the immediate moment. The household became a microcosm of the city, a web of actions, relationships, and observations, each supporting the other in continuity and harmony. As the afternoon light began to soften further, shadows lengthened across the mosaic floor. The children paused, reflecting on their work and play, while Claudia and the servants completed their tasks in preparation for the evening meal. Lucius allowed himself a final moment of quiet observation, noting the interplay of effort, attention, and care that had shaped the day so far. The lessons of patience, observation, and responsibility were not confined to study or labor. They permeated the rhythm of life, guiding household, family, and city alike. By late afternoon, the household settled into a brief pause, a moment of quiet before the transition to evening and the preparations for another meal, conversation, and reflection. The ordinary, repeated carefully and attentively, revealed itself once again as the foundation of life, sustaining both character and continuity, domestic harmony, and the subtle web of connections that extended outward into the city.